Welcome back, everyone. What's the role of innovation in shaping the next medical breakthrough? We're joined today by David Reddy. David is the Director General of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, or IFPMA. That's the industry body representing the world's research-driven pharma industry at the United Nations. Over the past 2 decades, this industry has delivered nearly 1,000 new medicines and vaccines, protecting people against life-threatening diseases and saving countless of lives. David, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
For those who don't have the benefit of working closely with IFPMA the way that we at WIPO do, can you please explain to us a little bit more about what's the mission and what are you all doing?
IFPMA is the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. We represent around 40 multinational research-based companies and 53 associations worldwide. Our mission is to ensure that scientific innovation from our research-based companies turn into the next generation of medicines and vaccines that can improve the health and well-being of people globally. Now, we realize as an industry we can't do this on our own. We're part of an ecosystem. And so our role at IFPMA primarily is to represent the industry to the UN organizations, WHO, WIPO, WTO, G20, OECD, and also the G7.
I would love to start the conversation by diving right into an extremely important part of your work, which is IFPMA's engagement with the G7's 100-day initiative, which is all about pandemic preparedness. Please tell me about what innovative pharmaceutical industry is bringing to this initiative and how IFPMA is contributing.
Thanks. Well, the 100-day mission it's extremely important. So it's an initiative, as you said, that came out of the G7. The industry has been intimately involved in this, and it's because of the role that we played in the COVID-19 pandemic and we will play in any future pandemic. One of the fundamental things we need to do when we look at the 100-day mission is to reflect on what went really well during the COVID-19 pandemic and what didn't go so well and what do we need to improve upon. One of the things that went well was that there was very early and immediate access to the pandemic strain, particularly the sequence information that came from us. And that meant that that really starts the clock ticking. And from that point forward, scientists were able to then develop the next generation of vaccines against COVID-19 in this case, which were delivered within 326 days of actually having that access. Now, can we do better? I think we can do better, particularly because the technologies we used at that time, the mRNA technologies, were breakthrough technologies. And so there was a lot of work to be done to bring those to scale. We'll also be able to bring on top of that now things like artificial intelligence that can help us predict very early on the types of antigens, sequences that we should be targeting to actually go after the next generation of vaccines. But as I said, that really relies on the starting point being when we can get access to it. Now, when we reflect on the technologies, we think, wow, that was great, and we almost take it for granted. But just to put that in perspective, I actually started working on mRNA technologies for antiviral use in the mid-'80s. And most of that stuff didn't work. But it's all part of a cumulative scientific learning that meant by the time we got to the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, a lot of those technologies were mature enough to then be taken forward and form the basis of the next vaccine. And so it's absolutely critical that we can bring innovation into this in that way, and that the environment is equipped to sustain it, if you like. The other element that didn't go so well was access. And there were many issues around this. One of them was the trade restrictions that actually prevented the flow of vaccines from one geography into another. And in particular, Africa was hit very hard as a continent by both the timing and some of the restrictions that had been put in place. And so within the 100-day mission, we need to look at innovation. We need to ensure that there is access to the viral ingredients, if you like, that we need to be able to develop vaccines, that there's intellectual property that gives us the assurance that we can actually move ahead and make the investments that are required, but also that the other elements of the environment are all in place so that if we do develop a vaccine, it can get to patients incredibly fast.
That's really interesting. And I noticed that you've focused a lot on vaccines. And as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, the vaccines, there's a big focus on them, but there was also a focus on therapeutics and, of course, diagnostics to know if you even had the pathogen. Does innovation look different when we compare vaccines with diagnostics with treatments?
So each of them has their own peculiarity, if you like. But they all share a common element, and that is they're all based on innovation. They can all leverage existing platforms, and then particularly with drugs, one of the things that is most striking is that there is the potential to repurpose drugs, particularly if you get medicines that have some pan-viral activity across different strains. Just because of the very nature of viruses, there might be some things that are in common. And so they can have a greater or lesser amount of activity, but early in a pandemic, they can serve a useful purpose. And so we need to look at drugs as a critical element for patients that do become infected, but in some cases, drugs, for example, may have a role in prevention until we can get highly effective vaccines coming through. So the mix is important. And I guess the backbone of this really is also diagnostics, and it's something that that was critical during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was great that we saw the molecular diagnostics PCR come through. Everybody knows what a PCR is now. Can you believe it? I mean, it wasn't something that the public generally understood until COVID-19. I mean, they understand replication rates now. But then we got the types of diagnostics, the rapid ones that could be used at home, etc. And that was absolutely critical, because what that allows people to do is to take a certain amount of responsibility and self-judgment and protect themselves and others within the community. So all of these ingredients need to come together. They're all underscored by innovation. And for that innovation to occur, it needs to occur not only at the time of the pandemic, but have the ingredients lined up in advance, and that relies upon intellectual property protection.
I really like your point around the fact that it was an opportunity for the general public to essentially learn more about the space that you and I work in every day, which is public health, epidemiology, development of new pharmaceutical technologies. And I feel like IFPMA in particular played an important role in the COVID-19 response. You all were on so many important coordinating initiatives and coordinating bodies. And I think one of the richest legacies that has emerged and that we see in your global health progress indicator and web page is that you all are now in a much more public way tracking what is R&D-based pharmaceutical industry's contribution to realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that's a really positive legacy. And I would love to hear more from you about that initiative. Where does it come from? And where are you going with it?
What I see in the companies that we're representing is an extraordinary drive to try and make progress, not only in pandemic preparedness, but also just in health in general, and that's progress and access. The initiative that you're talking about, what we've tried to do here is just to bring together initiatives, roughly 300 initiatives spanning about 1,100 different partners, from governments to international organizations, not-for-profit organizations, which prior to IFPMA, I was at a not-for-profit organization working with the industry. And so, these partnerships are absolutely critical, particularly in ensuring that the type of innovation that we bring forward really meets the needs in markets and is adapted. And secondly, that we work with partners to ensure they get to patients. And one of my former colleagues always said, look, all this stuff that you guys are doing in terms of R&D is useless because none of those compounds become medicines until they get into the mouths or the arms of the patients that need them. And so what I see from the people I engage with in companies is a really strong desire to see that happen. And in fact, last week I traveled and spent a significant chunk of time talking with one of the CEOs of one of the major multinational companies, and his focus was really tangibly on how can I increase the number of people that actually have access to the types of therapies we're talking about by 100 million people. And this is in low and middle income countries. This is the type of focus that I'm seeing from some of the memberships, and it comes through in the trackers that we're looking at. The other thing for us that's important is this is not an exercise in putting up 300 partnerships and saying, look, aren't we doing well? Because we're not doing well unless we're having impact. And so at the moment, we're also doing what we call an IDAP, an Innovation Development and Access Pathway Mapping, where we're looking at the barriers to access and what we're doing. And ideally, those partnerships should align and help solve those barriers. And if they're not, then we need to change something. And so that's the sense of responsibility that I think the industry feels and is pursuing. And it's reflected in that initiative.
And that sets up actually my next question perfectly. Because we're in WIPO, the house that IP built, and the global international agency for IP, I'd like now to ask some IP-specific questions. And my first one is, in your interactions with industry, because you mentioned that you've also previously worked with an NGO, and you've also overseen, it seems IFPMA has over 1,100 partnerships, which is incredible. How have you seen the use of IP evolving in R&D-based pharmaceutical industry?
So I think it's fundamental. First of all, IP is fundamental to the operating model because, it's the same as buying a house. You purchase a house and you expect to be able to live in it for a certain period of time, etc. And it's the same with intellectual property. If you invest significantly in generating some new technology, etc., then you have to get sufficient return on investment to be allowed to be enabled to develop the next generation, if you like, and just continue that virtuous cycle moving forward. So the principle is really clear, the practice, etc. So I think one of the principles here is accumulating over time. That innovation has a period of patent exclusivity, but then becomes the next generation of generic drugs. And so we've actually seen the availability of both innovative drugs and generic drugs increase over time. Over the last 20 years, we've launched something like, as an industry, 942 new molecular entities that have translated into new drugs. This is extraordinary progress, but the future is much, much brighter. And I think it's on the underpinning of the IP background. It also allows, and I talk a lot about the big multinational companies that I tend to represent, but even startup companies, IP allows them to get capital, venture capital money, to then allow them to move ahead and on their own develop to a certain point where generally they will partner with larger companies, et cetera, to take it to scale. So that's a critical ingredient. I think one of the things that we're seeing changing is that we're seeing a mix of approaches being used to increase access. So I mentioned the focus we've got, the real focus on trying to increase access in the low and middle income countries. That's been done through largely equity-based tiered pricing. What we find is that pricing isn't the only barrier, so it needs to be accompanied by other things. And one of the approach that's also been used has been sub-licensing and technology transfer. And that has allowed both scale to increase, and it has also allowed lower cost manufacturing by a generic manufacturer that doesn't have to include the R&D costs that we're talking about. Now that's a tool that can be used in certain situations. It has to be used in a way that's strategic and sustainable, and where it actually does contribute to increasing access, particularly where there are questions of scale. And so many people are looking at that right now as, that's the solution. Well, A, there's a lot of risk. Secondly, there's significant timelines and cost involved in that. And so what's the trade-off if you're looking at that as an approach? But then I think, how do you make it sustainable? And it's not sustainable if you're producing drugs, but your real barrier is actually that you can't get access to the patients because of other deficiencies in health infrastructure or human resources that are required. And so, the key thing here is, yes, it's changing, and you're seeing a willingness on the part of the industry to engage in this, and it's being done day in, day out, but it has to be done in the right strategic context.
So you spoke specifically about access, and the fact that once we have these life-changing innovations, how are we ensuring access to them where they're needed? How are we ensuring that they're getting into the mouths and the arms of the patients? Can you think of a particularly innovative way that you have seen IP used specifically to increase access?
Okay, so I think I could talk about, first of all, the product development partnership model. And I worked as the CEO for MMV, the Medicines for Malaria venture, for 13 years. And the intellectual property was core to our operating model with industry. And so what it allowed us to do was it allowed us to engage with industry. Often we would jointly generate intellectual property. MMV would file patents, and then we would use them in discussions with other partners. Generic companies that we had generic companies that then came on board as development partners. So they actually got into the R&D continuum, and it was important for them that they had intellectual property and we could transfer that to them. So what we began to see was a real blurring, but a real beneficial blurring, where the generic companies were actually seeing the value of IP and securing it themselves. The other thing we were able to do with IP is we saw it as two sides of a coin. And so one side is you get a benefit of exclusivity to recoup your investment and allow you to reinvest in the next generation. But the other side of that is that we need to then work to ensure that there is access. And within MMV, what we did with our partners is we put in place access clauses, which they agreed to, which really focused on affordable pricing in low and middle income countries, particularly in this case malaria endemic countries, particularly through the public sector, which is the most critical in this environment. And it worked. It's really worked because we've been able to get, as with us and our partners, we were able to get more than 1 billion courses of treatment distributed and save millions of lives. And this was at very affordable prices. And it included working with Global Fund. So the ingredients were there. So I think intellectual property was core to that operating model. But the other thing that was as important was partnership. And some of the partnership actually relied on IP.
Thank you so much, David, for spending the morning with us here in the WIPO studios. And it's been a delight to have you here.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this conversation on the vital role of innovation and collaboration in advancing global health. I hope you've gained valuable insights from the voice of the R&D-based pharmaceutical industry. And please stay connected with us for more thought-provoking conversations in the world of IP and global health by subscribing to WIPO's channel for inspiring videos that showcase how innovation and creativity shape our world and our lives. Until next time, stay well.